historical topic. I think you're Patrick Wyman, so I know why you're invested in it. It's great to see you. Thanks for coming. My name is Doug. I do a show called Literature and History. This is Vanya from Ancient Greece Declassified. I'll let each of you guys introduce your own shows real quick. Rhiannon from Emperors of Rome and miscellaneous other programs through her university. This is Ryan Stitt from the History of Ancient Greece, and Zoe Constance from Looted. So you guys want to just go through real quick before we launch into our panel discussion and introduce your show and what you do.
Well, so my name is Vanya. I do a show called Ancient Greece Declassified, which basically tries to do what Rhiannon did for Rome, but for Greece, which is, except I'm the one interviewing, not being interviewed, but I look for scholars of her caliber, and I ask them questions and try to make them explain things in plain language that anybody can understand and appreciate.
I'm Rhiannon, and I'm part of Emperors of Rome with my colleague Matt Smith. And we do a lot more than emperors now, because I looks like the name is a bit misleading. But we started off by tracing the emperors of Augustus through basically looking at the text of Suetonius and talking about sources and so on. But now it's become a general podcast on ancient Rome and Roman literature too.
I'm Ryan Stitt. I do the History of Ancient Greece podcast. I'm basically the Greek equivalent of Mike Duncan's The History of Rome, but I do tend to focus a little bit more, not a little bit more, a lot more on the social, cultural, religious, and non-political military side of the history of things. That's what I was fascinated in. So we go quite into depth about those. It's narrative, chronological / digressive, in that not interview formats like those. You just hear me, although there are a few guest episodes because
Hi, I'm Zoe Constance. I'm an archaeologist, and my podcast is stories of looted antiquities. Each episode talks about the history of an object or objects and where it came from, where it's going, where it's been. And I study looted antiquities in general, so it's classical objects of Greece and Rome, mostly.
All right. So this is going to be probably one of the more academic panels at Sound Education, just because that's our roots. So we're each going to give about, it looks like, how long do we have here? Oh, that's the wrong slide. Let me fix that.
It's 10:37.
Okay. A 10 to 15 minute presentation, and then we'd like to just have a discussion at the end with input from the audience. I don't know if we have any classicists in the room, do we? Great. And historians too. If you've heard these host shows, then feel free to ask them about their work. And Vanya, you want to start?
Well, I was hoping Ryan was
Oh, is Ryan starting?
Like I introduced myself, I'm Ryan Stitt. Before I get into like my methodologies and the podcast, I want to talk a little bit about how the podcast started and how I came to classics, because that really, really influenced what I do. So I didn't know anything about classics until I got to college. I think I was very poor family growing up. Grew up on a farm in eastern Pennsylvania. So when I got to college, no idea. I didn't know what Latin was. I was like, what are these? But I learned through untraditional means, as in I discovered podcasts early. I discovered iTunes U, a bunch of courses in there. The great courses I learned through sound, through hearing, before I actually took an official class and became a major. So when I did start the podcast, I was completely comfortable with that medium, because that's how I learned it. So that really impacted me going forward. And so like I said before, the History of Rome podcast was a big influence on mine, and I waited for quite a bit to. I was hoping for a Hellenistic equivalent, and it never came. And I was a grad student, or I was taking grad courses, and I eventually left to pursue other line of work. And I was thinking about starting the podcast, and I didn't do it because I was just petrified of failure for the longest time. So I wanted to do it since like 2011, and it didn't start until 2016. I was just absolutely petrified of it, because I was like, nobody will listen to me. Everybody that does that has like credentials that I didn't have. So finally, I got into this job, and I had so much free time, and I just started out by like editing Wikipedia articles, and that's how I got a lot of research in, because I was just researching to edit Wikipedia articles because I'm nerdy like that. And then I was like, I should actually do this and put it towards something. And after I had left classics, I still kept up with my Greek and Latin. I was better at Greek than Latin, and I came across this. It was in Seneca in his Hercules Firenze, and it was this one quote that really hit me, and it sticks with me. And it talks about he shall either find a way or make one, and that line has become like an emblem. And I don't know. Ever since then, I was like, well, I should just go with it. So I jumped right in, beginning of 2016. I had no idea what I was doing. It was terrible. My first dozen episodes were awful. I had to go back and redo them. Actually, I bought a really nice microphone, but I didn't record from the microphone because I had never turned it on for the first dozen episodes. So I recorded straight from the laptop, and I was like, why does everybody have such good audio and mine is terrible? That's how like unfamiliar I was with recording. But experience is the best teacher, and it got a lot better. I redid them all. To be honest, I had no idea that it would be that popular as it has been. I stepped into a very good. People wanted a Greek equivalent like I did. It stepped into a very good vacuum, and as it got popular, my vision for it changed. Usually, it was just me. I was going to do a narrative history. It was just me as a hobby, just researching, just teaching, kind of. But like, it was more for me. It was more of a passion for me. And then as it became more popular, I was like, and people were listening. It kind of took a greater responsibility to expand and make sure that I was doing this better and more analysis instead of just less regurgitation of facts. And you can tell around like the 20-ish, 25 episode part, they start going from like 40-minute episodes to an hour because I start doing more. So my methodology, as I said, I was very heavily influenced by the history of ancient Rome, ancient world, a bunch of those podcasts, and they're very narrative focused as opposed to, the interview style focus, which I was more comfortable with that, doing the research, because as I started out just doing research for my own interest as a hobby. So the podcast itself has become a kind of an audio version of a textbook. It's meant to encapsulate as much as I could possibly put forward into it with and if there's details that I don't know, I'll expand upon them. And it's not just political or military history either. That's what it started out with. I was very, very Thucydides-like in nature when I started, and as I'll talk about tomorrow, it ended up being more Herodotus. I go off in these digressions all the time, but we seem to find our way back, and I actually appreciate that more now because you can cover so much. So, for instance, when I cover, say, the 6th century or 7th century BC, I'll go through the narrative of the entire political military narrative, and then I'll circle back and talk about all the different social changes, how the economy changed, different cultic change, like all that sort of stuff. So it is chronological, but it's also thematic. And when I started the podcast and when I got deep into the archaic period, I really found out why nobody did Greece before. Because unlike Rome, where you have unlike Rome, where you have like one point projecting forward until the empire, they were a hot mess for quite a while. There's like city-states all over the place. There's no like one storyline. I had no idea how to structure it. It was a lot of trial and error. I was just like, there's things going in the east, there's things going in the west. So essentially, not only is it century and thematic, it's also theater. So I have to let's go see what the Eastern Greeks are doing. Let's go see what the mainland's doing. Let's go see what those pesky Sicilians are doing. And so you can see how digressions occurred. And that's kind of, it developed that way into what it is now. And I'm in the 5th century, and I feel like I've been in the 5th century for a year and a half now. People are like, when are you going to get to the Peloponnesian War? I don't know. I'll get there eventually. It's like, yeah.
Nothing important happened in the 5th century. Just
so,
right through it.
yeah, there's quite a bit. So in how I make the podcast, like I said, I really started out, I was just reading the historians. So Herodotus, that was my plan. Like Herodotus, Thucydides, Xenophon, Plutarch. I was going to read them and then just kind of talk about it and add outside sources. and then that kind of changed. So for each episode, I read all the primary sources, and then I go into the second. I try to go into about 4 to 8 secondary sources for each. It's very OCD in my part, and it has caused me a lot of extra time because I'm like, I need more sources because it feels incomplete. But I gather all of that, and I usually I like to stay about 8 episodes ahead in my research because like 8 episodes. It doesn't stay that way anymore. But that was the initial plan because so I could change things as I saw as I saw the outline developing. And as in terms of outline, I had an initial thought of 50 episodes, and I'm at episode 84, and like I said, I haven't got out of the 5th century yet, so it's gonna be a while, or 83. So I like to stay 8 episodes ahead. That way, if life happens, I don't be like, I have to research all week, that sort of stuff. I can just edit, or I can just record. I've had some major life things happen in the past year, so that has dwindled down to 1 at the moment, like 1 episode in the bank. But when that happens, I make a rough draft. I write a rough draft of that, and then I put it away. And then I go on and do research for the next thing. And then the week of the episode that I'm going to record, then I'll pull that out, I'll make a final draft, and then I go in and I read it aloud and make sure that makes sense. And that was another early issue that I had, was writing for hearing. I sounded like a robot for the first 20 episodes, and it took a little while to loosen up, and because it's scripted, to learn how you want to hear something. And so the rough draft is usually pretty robotic, and then I'll go back and add my flavor, transitions, some of the stuff. A lot of the episodes kind of are off cuff now, because I'm like reading and I'm like, this is stupid. Now I have to edit it and say it again in like 4 different takes until I get it right. It's like, why did I even write this? Sounds like not a normal person speaking. And it took me a little process to get to where I'm at. But when I go back to the draft, or I'll finalize it, and then audio, I use, edit it, and then I usually record the weekend before I'm going to publish it. That way, giving me plenty of time. The typical. So I keep the podcast. They're getting progressively longer as I'm going about it, as I mentioned, because of the analysis that goes on. And usually a traditional or a typical script is anywhere from 12 to 18 pages, single spaced, because I don't like double space. Weird. I don't like the way it looks. And it's quite detailed intensive, but that's what I like, and so I tell this to anyone who wants to make a podcast, especially history. It's like, do what you know, do what you're passionate about, don't do what you know. And I am very detailed. I like the details. I like going into the details, like this, and this. And some people are like, oh, there's just too much details. I was like, well, I mean, that's how it is. So anywhere from 12 to 18 pages, and after I publish, I publish I record at home. I'm an independent podcaster with very small budget, so I do it at home. You can even hear my dog sometimes in some of the episodes because I can't keep him to shut up. He'll just start making noises, or he just goes drinks water. I try to edit it out, but sometimes you just can't. I'm independent podcaster, budget. The history of ancient Greece is now still in the 5th century. My plan for it is to go to Actium, and one of the big draw points of me to do the Greece podcast was I really wanted to cover the Hellenistic period from the Eastern perspective, because most of what people learn is Rome came here and conquered them, and this is their significance. But I wanted to talk about the Eastern portion, and I also wanted to talk about the non-Greek cultures that were influenced by the Greeks. So that when I get there, that means I could talk about India or all the way in the East, and I'm really looking forward to that. Which just means when I get there, we're going to be in massive digression after digression. But I like that. And so, yeah, that's the history of ancient Greece. it's been a process to get to where I'm at now. It started at like very, very robotic, very matter of fact, very like I was just going to talk about Herodotus' stories. I'm talking about Thucydides' stories, and it was meant to be just for me. And then it evolved into I'm going to talk about everything that we could possibly talk about and turn it into like this educational outlet, because for me, I learned through audio, and it just, at least I can give back. And I've already gotten responses like, I love ancient Greece. I've never known anything about ancient Greece, and because of your podcast, I'm into that now, and I'm even studying it because of that. And it's like that was the entire point of it to begin with, because that's how I got into it. So that's all I have.
Awesome. Thanks, Ryan.
Yeah.
And it looks like our proper archaeologist is up next.
Okay. So my first lesson in looting came when I was excavating in Sicily, and it was a 4th century BC town. We were carefully excavating 5 by 5 meter trenches and methodically going through, recording the evidence, and one morning we came to find that looters had come with their metal detectors and ripped right through our stratigraphy and taken whatever it is. We don't know what they took, but not only did we not get to see what they found, but they destroyed all of the context for that trench. And that's not a unique story. You talk to any archaeologist and they'll tell you the same thing, or some version of it. And that story is actually on episode 4, if you want to hear more about that. And I actually, unlike Ryan, I only have 4 episodes. So I am right in the beginning of this whole process. And the goal for my podcast is to provide context for these objects that have been removed from the ground without proper excavation. And by contributing to education on these issues, I hope that I can help to curtail the plundering of antiquities, because I really think that public opinion can make a difference in these situations. So how did I get started with a podcast? Oh, thank you. Podcasting was not on my radar at all. I'm just a professor of classics. And I had, of course, listened to Serial, right, like everybody else. And now, of course, I've listened to all the fabulous podcasts on this panel. So I've expanded my listening. But the provost, the boss of the faculty at Kenyon, where I teach, came to me with a proposal from the Whiting Foundation. And so this is where mine is different from Ryan's, because this is actually a funded opportunity. So he came with this proposal. It pays to work at a small school, because the provost actually knew what I was working on, and he knew that I'd been studying these antiquities and also sort of going and doing public talks on them. I also taught his daughter in my Greek archaeology class, and she went on to be an archaeologist, which I don't know if he's glad about that or not, because provosts have intimate knowledge of faculty salaries, so there's that. But at any rate, I'd been teaching this seminar at Kenyon on looted antiquities. And when I taught it for the first time, it was amazing that the difference. The students went from saying, wow, that's cool, this object is cool, or unique, or beautiful, to really understanding that these were objects with histories and significance and connections. And even after just one class, they began to question what they'd previously taken for granted, like a museum label, for instance, right? Don't believe what it says, or maybe the label says, said to be from, or in the region of, or just Greece, right? Which is a pretty big place to be from. So I witnessed this kind of sharp learning curve, and I thought this would be something that I could do in a more public sphere. And coincidentally, I wrote a short opinion piece for the New York Times, which is always good as far as getting your work out into the world. And a consequence of that was a number of public speaking engagements. And by that, I mean non-academic audiences. And finally, I'd been doing a radio show on the college radio station for years. I play indie rock, I talk about bands, and going to shows. That's about it. But at least I had some experience with a microphone. With all of that, it still took me a while. So there was this proposal, come up with a proposal for a public engagement fellowship. And it just took me a while, and finally it dawned on me, how about a podcast? Let me take my experience in public speaking of these objects and my radio experience and put it together. And so an educational podcast series, as I argued in my application, was a widely accessible means of disseminating information to the public about antiquities trafficking. There is a fair amount of scholarship now on looted objects, but it's kind of hard to access that if you're not an academic. So I thought that a short talk on a certain piece that would inspire further thought and discussion could make a bigger difference to a wider audience. And by short, my podcasts are only 20 to 25 minutes, and already that's a lot of single-space pages. So Ryan, I don't know how you do it. It's hard. So, spoiler alert, I got the grant, right? And the Whiting Foundation, which is an incredible foundation, provided a 1-semester leave from teaching, and also some funds for materials and for travel. I visited museums in Seattle, Tokyo, New York, Baltimore, Washington, Boston, Cleveland, and Toronto. I went to Athens, Paris, and in Italy I went to Catania, Idone, Tarquinia, Cerveteri, and Rome, and I recorded all these experiences for the podcast. It was a lot. And of course I'd never done any recording before, so it was essentially disastrous from the beginning. Tokyo, I went all the way to Tokyo to see this exhibit of Greek material. And then they were very serious about their exhibit and didn't allow any pictures, even though all the material had been published before. And so I was too scared to take out the recorder, so I just didn't record anything. And then in Athens, I went to the Cycladic Museum. Cycladic figurines are little marble figurines that are the subject of episode 2 of Looted, if you're interested in those. But I was sneaking around with the recorder because I didn't know if I was allowed or I didn't want to disturb anybody. And so the recordings sound like somebody sneaking around with a recorder, and just terrible, like completely unusable, fuzzy, like this. So by the time I got to Sicily, genius, just figured out the whole pop filter situation, put it on the microphone, things were a little bit better. Then I got to the Louvre, I was seeing the Nike of Samothrace for the first time. I was so excited to go, ready to record. It doesn't work. I'm like, this thing doesn't work. Of course, it just ran out of batteries, right? So then I had to record on my iPhone. So eventually I figured things out, but it was a learning curve. And based on this description, you can guess that the whole production part of the podcast was a bigger hurdle than I imagined, although maybe not so surprising for an academic. I had a lot of questions when I first started. You know, how do you do a podcast? And people just said, you just figure it out. So I was okay, well, I have to figure it out. So at first, the project involved a lot more collaboration with other people than usually you have in an academic project, right? You just write your article and that's that. I had a tech collaborator who was supposed to help me figure out how to record and how to make a website and all that. He quit instantly. Day one, he just quit. So then I was okay. So I had no help there. But then other people came along and sort of contributed in surprising ways. So my podcast, like Ryan's, is a narrative podcast, and I read the script, but I put other voices in so that you don't have to listen to me just talk straight for 20 minutes. So the breakfast waiter from my hotel in Athens plays a Greek smuggler on episode number 1 of Looted. It's a starring role. So without a tech collaborator, I just had to sort of figure out what I was going to do for recording, and I used GarageBand. I don't know what you guys use. I'm interested to hear about it because I've eventually figured out GarageBand, which I think any small child could figure out. But then you get to a point where you can't. It doesn't do anything more, and maybe I just don't know how to do it. I'm going to the Hindenburg session later to figure out how to use some other sound recording.
Awesome.
So we'll see how that goes. Then I use PowerPress for the website, and that again also, you can do some pretty simple things, so it's simple to figure out, but then you can't really do anything more than that unless you know a lot more than I do about how to make websites. So that was time-consuming and difficult for me at any rate. And then with the website, the production of the podcast, there's a lot more creativity involved than in my normal academic work. And the scripts are pretty daunting to write. And just like Ryan said, it's a lot different to write for an audience that's listening to you as opposed to reading what you're saying or to seeing you. It's an entirely different kettle of fish from what I usually do, which is here's this really cool picture of this cool object and you can see it and interact with it. So when you can't use pictures or facial expressions or gestures, right, it makes it difficult to, or it makes it, you just have to make sure you can enliven your material without that. So that was a real learning curve. I knew what I wanted it to sound like, but it took a while to figure that out. And that's, adding other voices is part of helping with that. And then I also do some interviews, which is it's another editing problem, because I'll do an interview, I'll talk to somebody for an hour over Skype, and then I'll use 10 minutes of that. And then I have to take out all the you knows, so blah, 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 all that stuff. So anyway, that's a challenge for me. And then the music, because I'm a DJ, was really important to me, and I asked a student of mine who has a band to write the song, and everything he came up with was just like, I can't, this is really not good. But then I said to him, can you just make an instrumental version of the song? I really like that your band plays. And he did, and that's the music for the podcast. So it was cool to have that kind of collaboration with a student. And then finally, after all that, I made the first episode. I got my sister to listen to it. She was my first test audience, and she told me it was not funny. And that it was not as funny as my radio show. And I said, okay, so this is a fair warning if you want to listen to my podcast. Looted Antiquities are not funny.
Family doesn't pull punches, man.
Okay, and then so the next thing was promotion, because the goal of this fellowship that I got was public engagement. So how do you get your project out into the world? And I need to learn from this panel, because you all have billions more listeners than I do, and I don't know how to do it, but this is what I did. As an academic, I give public talks, so that's something I'm accustomed to doing, so I did that. But I did them in a non-academic way. Has anybody heard of Pechakucha? It's a series of, you've heard of it, it's 20 minutes, or 20 slides for 20 seconds each, that's what it is. And anybody can talk, and it's held in cities all over the world. So it's just a night of Pechakucha, and you just go and talk. And so I went and talked about looted antiquities. There was a guy who talked about, who plays baseball without gloves, like some sort of old kind of baseball without, anyway, he's a lot of broken fingers. There was a lady who talked about frogs, and then someone who talked about the parole system in Pennsylvania. So it was a really wide range of topics, and then a really wide range of audience. And it was really actually very good, even though it was so short. It was really good for me to streamline my ideas for a public audience. So I thought that was good. And then, sort of on the same lines, Costco asked me to do a piece for them. That Costco, where you buy lots of bulk toilet paper or whatever, they have a magazine. Did you know that? I didn't know. It's called the Costco Connection. And certainly as an academic, you're not accustomed to having your piece sandwiched between the health benefits of beets and which are the best hammers, which is actually where my piece is. But it's a public-facing project, so I was trying to get it out as much as possible. And Costco claims to have 12 million subscribers. Notice they don't say readers. I don't know what they do with those magazines, but that's a lot of people. And I got a lot of people contacting me after that, so it was interesting. Finally, what's interesting is that this project, which was designed to take academic research out of academia into the public, has caught the attention of academia. So last spring, the University of New Hampshire asked me to come and talk in a series that they do, and it was my largest audience to date, and I was talking about the podcast. And then at our annual classics conference this winter, I'll be talking on a panel which is all classics podcasters. So even classics is catching on to the podcasting business. I think it's probably the first panel of its kind at our meetings. And I'll just say that because things are changing, if you're interested in doing a classics podcast, there are avenues for funding. So the Whiting is a really fabulous foundation if you're an academic, and also the American Council of Learned Societies and the NEH. Those all have fellowships that you can apply for if you're interested in getting your project started with funding. Thanks.
Great, thanks.
Okay, so Emperors of Rome, how did we get there? In a way, I feel bad talking about this because Matt Smith, the other half of the podcast, does, I would say, the bulk of the work for the podcast. I had to write him a quick email before I left Australia saying,
what recording equipment do we use? People might ask me. I said, no one's going to ask you, Rhiannon, but he did tell me. And he would love to be here, but he has a very young family. In fact, Matt was sort of the inspiration for the podcast, but it didn't start as a podcast. I started working at La Trobe University in 2012, and he emailed me out of the blue. He worked for Media and Communications at the time, and he said, I want to interview you about your research. I see you've published something on Pliny the Elder. He sounds great. Let's talk Pliny the Elder. And I was like, I haven't thought about him for 5 years. I'm starting a new job. I've got to write all these new courses. Okay. But we did it, and it was really good. And he had, done some research and was really interested. And I don't know what it sounds like or if it's even available now, but we did this 20-minute conversation about Pliny the Elder, and it was put up on some La Trobe website. How many people listened to it, I'm not really sure. But after that, Matt said, actually, when I arrived there, he was already putting classics lectures up on iTunes U. So my colleagues, I arrived halfway through the year. Their first semester on ancient Greece, the lectures were available on iTunes U, and they were quite popular. So this involved taking a recording device into the lecture. Our lectures are recorded anyway by a system that's in the theatre, but the sound quality is not great. So he gave us this little recording device, and then we'd have to literally take it to him and send him the slides as a handout, and then he would upload them. And my colleague Gillian Shepherd, who taught the Greece subject, said to me, I find it terrifying. What if John Boardman's listening? Because he's a big Oxford class. She does Greek art in particular. And I said to her, I don't think John Boardman is listening to our lectures on Greek history and art. But I think that encapsulates what I was thinking when Ryan was speaking, that it doesn't really, Gillian has been teaching for 25 years in universities, and you're still terrified about getting something wrong. And people knowing, and I think especially coming from a time certainly when I was an undergraduate, lectures were given once and that was it. I remember joining a course late, I had to beg the notes from somebody because there was no record of them. And that lecturer was not going to sit down and talk through 5 weeks of lectures with me. Whereas now they're kind of there in a permanent state. And we're all, I've got over it a little bit, but still this state of anxiety that someone's going to find a mistake. And they have found the odd mistake in the podcast. And to be honest, it's not the end of the world. You just write a message on Facebook or record something in the next podcast saying, yeah, we got the date of Titus's birth wrong, or there's some, it's controversial. We don't exactly know, and we took one line and actually potentially it's another one. And really, it's just the day of the Emperor Titus's birth, so it's not that big a deal. You have to kind of get over yourself. But then classics teaches you to be really detail-oriented. It is one of its strengths. But it also means that potentially we can be a little bit stressed about putting it out there. And I really had to get over that. The iTunes U lectures for my subject, the Roman world, my course, were very, very popular. And Ryan told me to listen to them, which was really fantastic. And that got, what Zoe was saying, it got a lot of attention from the press because it was kind of up there at the top border, from what it's called, of Apple's series at one point, and they named me as one of the top 20 teachers in the world, which was just on numbers. It was the only one outside of the US. So that meant that the newspaper, The Australian, got in touch with us, and we were interviewed by them, and I said incredibly stupid things because I'd never been interviewed by the media before. So I said, well, I don't think it's going to make me a professor tomorrow, amongst a whole load of other things. And of course, that was the only thing they quoted, which made me sound like an idiot. My university got interested in all of this in 2014. I mean, Matt was basically doing it on his own. He had free will to do what he wanted, and he did these iTunes U lectures. So the university kind of put a pro-vice-chancellor in charge of a scheme to try and monetize this, because my university is relatively poor. They want to monetize. So we put a whole online course up available to anybody in the world to do with no advertising. There was no advertising budget. This was a big mistake. It was all meant to flow from all of these thousands of people listening to the Roman world. It was an utter failure. People don't want to pay. This is a free resource, and that's the way they see it. Of course, people will pay small amounts to, say, to Kickstarter campaigns, but they're not going to pay thousands and thousands of dollars for something that's basically available anyway. So that was interesting and a learning curve. And after that, Matt said to me, why don't we do podcasts instead? So that's a long way to where the podcast began in 2014. And we recorded, I think, 6 or 7 episodes. Like Ryan, I would hate for you to go and listen to them on Julius Caesar. We were just figuring out what on earth to do. It was a conversation from the start. So the process or methodology basically is that Matt goes away and has a look at the topic and comes up with, we never have 18 pages of notes. He has maybe 1 or 2 pages in a Google Doc of quotes and points. And then I go through it and I say, we need to talk about this as well. This is really important, or this is a great quote, or I don't know the answer to that. Let's not do that. I don't think anybody knows. But it is actually a great way of doing it in a way, because it means that he asks the questions that somebody who isn't a specialist, he has a geography degree, he's just really interested in ancient Rome, the kind of questions they would ask. So the questions like, what is a princeps? All right, what's the principate? Or what are lurbs? He's fascinated by lurbs now. He's trying to collect all the lurbs. But, the general public doesn't necessarily know what a lurb classical text is. And that sort of, I always thought of myself as somebody who could relate to the students and remembered what it was like not to know these things. But of course, as I get older, I remember less and less. And I can feel, my PhD advisor, Amy Richland, told me this. She says, as you get older, the students come and see you less. You're just further and further away from them. And she sounded really sad about it at the time, and I think it started happening to me a little bit. So Matt kind of keeps me a bit anchored down to, and I'm not saying that he knows nothing, despite the fact that he says that in media terminology, he is what is called the cabbage, which is the person who's just there to ask questions, and even if they do know, they have to pretend they don't know. So we kind of have that setup where he will ask me to explain things. So we've got these 2 voices going on.
It's very funny too.
Yeah, and we have a pretty good rapport, which I think helps with that. We record probably an hour for each podcast, and he will cut them down quite brutally. And some people complain, some of our audience complains that they're too short. They have got longer as time has gone on, partly because he's got more interested in the research, and I've got just more prolix. I just talk more. And he has to cut out all of my ums, which you're getting now. You don't get them on the podcast. I think he clears them out, although, to be honest, I find it difficult to listen to my own voice. I don't listen to all of them. Pretty quickly, it became clear that we did Julius Caesar, and people seem to be listening to that, so let's do the emperors. So we called it Emperors of Rome. That is now proving to be a bit of a bind, because we did the emperors of the 1st and 2nd century CE, so Augustus to Commodus, going more and more slowly. So he'd say, I think we can get 2 podcasts out of Nero, and I think we got 5. So we always have more material than we think we're going to have. But by the time we got to Commodus, I realized classics is or it certainly was in my day. As an undergrad, I didn't learn about Commodus. We'd ended way below that. Everything after about 120 CE was, that's very late. You don't go there. Latin is sort of falling apart after Tacitus. So it started to be slightly out of my comfort zone. And as I've said, I'm anxious about talking about things I don't know about. So fortunately, in terms of the emperors, this kind of narrative of one emperor after another, we have a colleague in Macquarie University in Sydney, Caelan Davenport, who has continued the emperors, talking to Matt, and Matt has to go up to Sydney occasionally, and Caelan just came down to do 5 podcasts in a day. So we've got somebody continuing with the emperors, but even before we sort of completed the set of emperors, when we started, I think we thought we'd get to Nero maybe, which is, he dies in 68 CE, and we've gone on for another 140 years after that with me, and then on further with Caelan. So we didn't really know what we were doing at the start and how far it would go. But even when we were doing those early emperors, we realized we can talk here about this narrative of the emperors, but there's all kinds of other interesting things going on in Rome. For a start, we should talk about women. We should talk about the empresses. So we've had podcasts on people like Livia and Agrippina. And also we should talk about social issues. We've just done the one on slavery, which has been on our list for so long. So we want to broaden out from that kind of elite top-down view of Rome, which classics itself has done over the last 20 or 30 years.
You do literature too.
We do literature too. I should say that, people often talk about how Matt and I have this good rapport. The literature is what we kind of argue over because he really doesn't want to do it. He doesn't feel comfortable in that zone. He's very happy if I talk to other people about literature. So the one podcast where I've been the interviewer, and I interviewed my colleague Sonia Wurster about Philodemus and Epicureanism, he was so happy to leave that to us. While I'm here, my old colleague Peter Davis, who was my first boss in Australia, is going to be in Melbourne, and Matt has to interview him about Ovid, and he's so annoyed that I'm here not to do that, because literature is not something he feels comfortable talking about. We sort of gather, and I think all the people here probably do, a little bit about what our audience is from the people who write to us, which may or may not be representative, or people who write on Facebook comments or tweet with us. And it was much broader than we thought. I guess we thought we were doing it, if we thought about it at all, for history enthusiasts. And we sort of aimed it at that level of people who were intelligent but might not have been very familiar with this, or maybe they learned it back in their school days but they've sort of parted company with it for a while. But it became very clear to us that it was all kinds of people. So my favorite one are the emails from people who are trucking across the North American continent and just listening to them as they go. So we have lots of truckers listening. We have a huge audience in Canada. I don't know why Canada, with, I guess, long winters, I don't know. High school students, high school teachers, civil servants. Occasionally I get emails from very high up CEOs. And I had a novelist, Arthur Golding, sent me his novel, The Memoirs of a Geisha, saying he was an enthusiastic listener. And breastfeeding mothers, because there's a lot of time involved where you can't really be doing other things. So we've got this very diverse audience, and I think that's probably true of everybody up here. Let me see, what else do I need to cover? One of the issues that I think all academic podcasters have to face up to is how far outside your specialism to move. And I'm coming back to where I started, really. At the beginning, I would not have thought that I'd be comfortable talking about the kind of material I have on the podcast, because I felt like I should only talk about what my PhD was on. Well, there's a limit to how many people want to hear about narratives of geography in Roman texts. And, I'm not even sure it would fill one podcast for public interest. So I have to kind of appreciate that I don't necessarily know everything, but I do know where to go find it, usually. And so there is legwork going on. And I don't know whether it sounds like on the podcast it's all just in my head, but it really isn't. And I will be brutally honest with you that Matt cuts some stuff out where I'm saying, I can't remember that date, let me just look it up.
I didn't know that.
I think the recorder was so appalled by my lack of knowledge there that it exploded. So there is that to be getting over. I just want to finish up by talking a little bit about the context in which we do this. We are supported by La Trobe University, not directly financially, but at the start it was kind of an extra thing we did. Matt worked for Media and Com. I hope they never listen to this at La Trobe. They've changed, but back in 2014 they were not interested in podcasts. It was too many resources. As far as they were concerned, Media was about Twitter and Facebook because it's free, basically, apart from someone putting stuff up there. All of these resources that you have to, apart from the microphones, it's lots of time that you have to invest in this, not interested. Matt, his position there was made redundant a few years ago. Luckily, he was not made redundant because he was picked up not by humanities or history, but by La Trobe Asia. He works for La Trobe Asia, talking mostly about modern issues in Asia. But his boss at La Trobe Asia, who's also now my boss, allows him to do Emperors of Rome as a kind of a sideline within that remit. And when I started doing it, it was all extra to my other work. It's only recently, when it's become popular, that the university has realized they don't want to lose this, so we have this massively complicated workload formula, and now a little bit of my workload formula is dedicated to doing this podcast. But I have to say, and so in many ways I'm luckier than lots of people who do it independently. For one thing, I've got a tech person who will do all the editing for me. Secondly, we are to a certain extent supported by our university. But because I'm a worrier, I do think about the contingencies here, about what may happen. Like at the moment, our Vice Chancellor, who's, I can't remember what the equivalent's called in North American universities, but the head of the whole university, he loves us and has told me that he falls asleep listening to my voice. He said it in a non-sleazy way, it was fine. But Vice Chancellors move on. So who knows, if we got somebody who wasn't as sympathetic, maybe we wouldn't be in such a strong position. Similarly, the pro of doing this with somebody else is that there's a support system there. But if Matt gets a job somewhere else, I don't know what will happen with the podcast. So while we're not precarious, we are potentially precarious in the future. And as I say, being a warrior, I think about that. Finally, what we've learned through the whole process is think very carefully about your name. As we can't really change it from Emperors of Rome now, but it doesn't really encompass what we do. Planning is very good, but we are fairly ad hoc. We don't have very much of a script. I'm very good at tangents. I'm really glad that you love Herodotus now, because I do too. You don't need a PhD in a precise area to record an educational podcast on it. So, that expertise is all very well, but I guess what you need is the ability to research, to know where to go. I think that one of the secrets, as it were, and the university is always asking us, what is the secret of this success? We want to extend it. We want other areas of the university to do this. And I think it's partly luck or timing. I think consistency can help. So Matt does release them, it was only the birth of his second daughter really that stopped the every 2 weeks of the podcast coming out. But I think it is mostly tenacity and hard work, and everybody who's recorded a podcast knows just how much hard work it is, especially if you're doing the editing as well. And I guess having a topic that people want to hear about. Rome is everywhere on TV screens and documentaries, and so there is a passion for that. There is an audience out there that wants to listen to it, so we're really lucked out with our topic.
It's a hugely popular topic. Thank you. Okay, we have plenty of time left, so yeah.
All right, so my name is Vanya, but my podcast with a pseudonym, which is Lantern Jack, and my podcast is called Ancient Greece Declassified. And so the first time I ever heard about podcasts, the first podcast I ever listened to was 12 Byzantine Rulers. You guys know that?
Mm-hmm. You went straight for the headline and stuff.
Well, at the time, I didn't know what a podcast was. Somebody just sent me this link saying, check this out. And it was just a website where you could play. And I think I basically vanished for 3 days. Nobody knew where I was because I was listening to 25 hours of Byzantine regicide and royal fratricide and matricide, all kinds of things. And just was totally absorbed by the drama. But it took me several years after that to actually get the idea to do my own podcast. And there was a confluence of, I'd say, 4 main factors that contributed to that. First, I discovered dialogue format podcasts. In particular, I was listening to philosophy podcasts. And I was impressed by the pedagogical power of the dialogue form, because unlike a narrative, which is great for many things, when you listen to an interview or discussion, you put yourself in the mind of the questioner, and you're waiting to hear the answer, and you might want to guess how you would answer. It activates a different part of your brain, I think. And philosophy dialogue podcasts helped me prepare for my philosophy exams in grad school. And then, Rhiannon's courses and podcasts helped me prepare for my Latin general. In fact, I think I passed my Latin general because of Rhiannon. I I was listening to her podcasts every day for like 3 months, and then I just sailed through that exam like nobody's business. Unfortunately, there was nothing like that to help me with the Greek side of things. And so at that point, I realized that this was before Ryan started his podcast. So I realized there was kind of a gap. There was a lot of good Roman stuff, but nothing good for Greece. Furthermore, I was starting to see the light at the end of the tunnel of grad school, which actually started to look like a dim cave because there were no good prospects for jobs. And I thought, okay, I have a few more years of funding and housing. I might as well do something useful with my time and do something that will open new doors, allow me to meet awesome people. And then I guess the sine qua non was that I was also in a small town, very, very boring town, Princeton. And when you're in grad school in Princeton, there's not much to do except drink beer with friends and talk. So I would tell my friends stories about the ancient world, usually with a lot of slang and colloquial language, and they would encourage me to do a podcast quite frequently. So anyway, all those factors came together, and I decided that I wanted to help fill the gap for ancient Greece and get some good educational material out there so that future grad students can have a better time. But like Ryan, I spent probably like 2 years thinking about how to do this, what kind of format to adopt, and how long the episodes should be, whether they should be chronological or not. And in the end, I decided to do just like topic by topic, non-chronological, because, well, how do you tell the history of Greece as a story? You can't really do that. Although I have ideas about that now, maybe next project. But
well, logistically, sometimes you just have to interview the folks who you have access to, so it would be
Yeah.
difficult to go chronologically
also,
that way.
having a @princeton.edu email gets you surprisingly quick responses from academics who would otherwise totally ignore your emails. So I conceived of this project as like a mosaic where anybody can jump in and find different topics and explore them. And one thing I really wanted to accomplish, like one pedagogical goal, was to show the limits of our knowledge. Like in every single episode I do, I really try to bring out that we don't really know what you look up on Wikipedia is not really secure knowledge. And if you ask 5 experts about a certain topic, you'll get 5 different answers. And a lot of the things that I learned that were taught as gospel in undergrad, I later learned were not true. Like, we always learn in the Dark Ages, Greek writing totally disappeared. Well, not true. In Cyprus, it survives in a weird syllabic script. So almost everything that you learn, and that this idea that you just look up on Wikipedia what the answer is, I wanted to get away from that. I wanted to get scholars on the show who I could probe with questions, and I could bring up other opinions to show the plurality of opinions and the controversy surrounding those topics that we deal with. And furthermore, there still is no real place to go if you want like reliable and information on a wide range of topics in ancient Greece. I mean, now that I finished my PhD last summer and no longer have access to JSTOR and all the other awesome library stuff, I'm like paralyzed. Like I can't get any. I can like call people and say, "Can I use your login?" Like there's nowhere to go if you want to, look up a particular topic. So I'm trying to, to get a kind of library out there eventually. So let's see. Now I'm not just interested in ancient Greece. I call it ancient Greece declassified because everything with Rome has been taken, figured out to stick to Greece. But I do try to explore, the neighbors, Mediterranean. Basically, it's about the Mediterranean, the Mediterranean ecosystem of states, which eventually was eaten by the giant amoeba of Rome. That's the topic of my podcast. And finally, in terms of pedagogical goals, well, I guess it's not really a pedagogical. I wanted to help, save the Greek side of classics, because unlike Latin, which is doing great in America, largely due to Harry Potter and other similar children's books, which, I've tutored a lot of kids who, I asked them, why do you want to learn Latin? It's, oh, my favorite novel series has characters that have like a Latin play. There's no books like that for Greek, unfortunately. And at my esteemed home institution, Greek enrollment is at the lowest it's been ever in the history of the university. So, trying to make Greece cool. But let's see.
Make ancient Greece great again.
People have told me that I should make those hats and that they would buy them, but I just find it weird. Now, I'm in the interviewer seat. I guess I'm in the cabbage seat. But if Diocletian really appreciated cabbage, I think that makes it a more esteemed vegetable. So I'll carry that badge with pride. But I think and I admire Matt Smith's questioning abilities, and I try to take a similar Socratic approach, which I think is great because I don't know. There's something about creating a space from which information is generated as opposed to just injecting your own opinions.
Yeah.
Now, I do edit my episodes quite heavily, partially because the human mouth makes a lot of weird sounds that you don't want to hear right in your ear, but also because academics just talk a lot and nobody can follow. A typical answer I'll get. By the way, I've never interviewed anybody who didn't talk too much. And a typical answer will be, I'll say so why did X happen? Well, first of all, we should bear in mind that X didn't always happen because in this particular case, blah, blah, blah. But then again, so-and-so at Berkeley has pointed out that this and this happened. But to get back to your question, blah, blah, blah. However, what you really should be asking is this. Let's not forget, blah, blah, blah. So then I have to what do I do with this? By the end of the answer, nobody remembers what I asked, what the flow of information was, what the point of it was. So I just want my guests, I'm look, I'm going to either brutally edit you, or you can, be concise. And actually, one thing I've learned, probably the most important thing I've learned for interviewing is to just tell people to do it over again. Because it's a lot easier to say, listen, that was a wonderful answer, but can you say it again in a few words?
Yeah.
And then they'll just, they'll edit it for me, which is awesome. I don't have to edit anymore.
You guys ever do that?
Yes, well, I frequently get told to. It's more right at the beginning.
Yeah.
After about 3 years, I've learned that question is not going to be there. That question is going to be edited out. It took me so long, though. So I'm starting off the conversation. So I've frequently asked to repeat what I say because I'm saying it like it's an answer to a question. But yes, absolutely. But you need to say that more simply, or you stumbled there, do it again. It can be quite harsh.
So during my undergrad, I had the good fortune of spending a summer in Rome and studying Latin with the great Reggie Foster. I don't know if you guys know him, but yeah. And so I'm part of the growing community of people in America who like to actually speak Latin and speak Greek, and I really think that adds a new dimension to your understanding treat these activities with disdain. Like, why would you speak it? Just read it. You know? But I often, whenever I do like an episode on some kind of poetry, I will ask my guests to recite the stuff in the original language, and I've gotten emails from listeners saying that was amazing. Like, thanks for doing that. I've never heard that. And also, and you know, in the words of Reggie Foster, people who study classics and don't read it, don't speak it, it's like studying Mozart and only seeing the notes on paper. You know.
Yeah. Well, we were at this event, we were going to, and I had written it out, this ridiculously long 10 to 15 page document where I was asking them to recite really famous and salient passages, and both of you guys are fine with spoken Latin, particularly with spoken Greek and Latin, but there just wasn't enough time. But there is a dearth of that out there, really, of bilingual Latin and Greek, and I know my listeners, probably a lot of ours, would love to hear some ancient historians, some ancient literary figures in their original languages. So you've done a lot of work on that.
We occasionally do the intro in Latin if we're doing an episode about Latin, and that's sort of a fun off the cuff thing.
Well, and isn't the greeting like
Ave?
Ave?
Yeah.
Ave, yeah, we have arguments about that because of course I think it should be pronounced our way, and also. Anyway, it's a classics thing, but technically that's singular, and hopefully we have more than one listener. But then with podcasts, I guess it's as if you're speaking to that one person individually.
Sure.
I'm pretty terrible at speaking Greek, and I get a lot of responses about how, because I incorporate Greek words quite often, like vocab words like this, and then I'll tell them in English, and I get a lot of emails. That was not right. And I'm like, well, okay, there's many ways you can say it. There's the anglicized way, modern Greek way, ancient Greek way. So I'm not quite at their level yet, but at least I try.
I asked some Assyriologists recently how to pronounce some Sumerian names, and I got the funniest answer. We don't know.
That actually was another issue that I had when I started out, because I read so many texts, and you'd come across these people's names, and I've read them 30 times, and then I go to speak them, and I'm like, what? Like, how do you say it? Where do all these accents and these syllables go? And like, just how convoluted some ancient Greek names are, and I'm just like, YouTube, 4 different ways to say it. And then I'll just start speaking into it, and then I will just decide, I'll say it 4 different ways, and I'll decide, that sounds right, and I'll go with it. And usually my gut feeling's wrong. But yeah, I've come across these names so many times, and you go, and you just speak them, and you're like,
Sure. Well, we have, it looks like we've got a few minutes left, and I have a question both for the panel and for the audience that's kind of come up as we've talked as a group. I think we can all agree, and some folks in the audience cannot readily understand, that there are periods of the ancient world that have received very heavy coverage. The fall of Rome, which is fascinating, in which there are so many larger-than-life characters running around. 5th century BC Athens, which starts with the Greco-Persian Wars and then ends with the end of the Peloponnesian War. What areas of ancient history would all of us here like to see covered in more detail to get left behind?
Early history of Rome is also a hot mess, and I've not found the perfect podcast that really does that justice. Because anything that's a hot mess, it's still interesting. There's so many good stories to be told, but finding the creator or the storyteller that can articulate that.
So I have a suggestion. Have you heard the partial historians? The partial historians? Yes, one reads Livy, one reads Dionysius, and they come together and they talk through the early history of Rome. They're 2 PhD holders, Fiona Radford and Pia Greenfield from Sydney, Australia. I can give you the information, but you might like that. Another thing I want to add on, like he said, there was not much on Greece when we started 2016. It seemed like the last 2 years there's been a lot more classically themed podcasts sprouting up, which I'm excited to see. We started almost around the same time, and so did Jeff Wright, who does the Trojan War podcast. And it's like, oh, maybe if I didn't wait, it would have happened. But no, they all kind of came together, and then there's just a few dozen more That was a little bit older. I just didn't discover it until like 2 years ago. But yeah,
Early Rome is one. Yeah. What else?
So my father's from southern Greece, he built in Egypt, and he grew up speaking a language called Cyrenaica, which they debate whether it's from the ancient Doric, but is it from the ancient Spartans for military strategic?
Yeah.
There's only a few hundred people left, like 1,000. They're all starting to die off. Have you guys covered any of that, of the ancient speakers and where all that comes from? There's some debate in that region.
I haven't, but I haven't covered that specifically, but when I covered languages, I actually, on my episode in my show notes, I put there's a TED Ed talk about Sonic Greek that I can give you the link for. I haven't specifically talked it myself. Yeah.
My next documentary tracing me back, and there's one little group that's still trying to keep the language alive in the village of Dios. And there's some German scholars who have studied it, but I'd love to talk about it.
Yeah, awesome.
Do you have one?
Well, at some point, I would like to do an episode on like these far-flung dialects, like Pontic Greek, something like the Sicilian and Southern Italian stuff. That would be interesting. It's on my radar, but
Yeah. One that I would like to see is something that's purely on Achaemenid Persia. And Dan Carlin has done a bit of that. But what usually happens with Achaemenid Persia is it's either a little bit about the Babylonian captivity or almost always about the Greco-Persian wars. And I know we don't know as much about Achaemenid Persian history, but are there any materials just purely on that subject?
I did 10 episodes on it. I guess you don't listen.
Purely just from them,
So-
not the Greco-Persian wars.
So my OCD kicks in, and if I'm going to talk about a specific culture that the Greeks come across, so say with the Persians or the Carthaginians, I have backtraced and covered their entire history up to that point to tell you why they're significant.
So you know where to find that stuff.
but we can't
Kind of.
we can't get on the ground
Yeah.
in Persia and
Well, yeah.
around the way we can for Athens and Rome.
Yeah, exactly.
And
So, I mean, it's only 10 episodes. It's not a podcast.
Hellenistic period history. What do you know that's out there that the successors of Alexander, for
Same
instance?
problem. We
Yeah.
cannot get on the ground and see the world through their eyes.
Yeah, and it's hard to tell a story out of the granular matter of fragments and tendentious historians and.
I've connected with some academics who focus on that, and when I actually get to that, say 2025, at the rate I'm going, they're gonna hook me up with sources and stuff. And that's like Vanya was talking about, like when you leave the academy, you don't have access to certain stuff, but I've found people who will send me things that really beneficial helps, and then I send my scripts off to people, be like, so like when I did I did like 5 episodes on ancient Greek women and marriage and all that sort of stuff, and that was completely out of my element. I felt like a fish on land because I had never studied it specifically. Like she was talking about, I was like, should I do this? Like I don't have an expertise in this, but I found people who did, and I was like, I have books. Now, are these books, is this research old? Like, am I just gonna tell off old theories? And so I sent them out, and you do the same with your podcast. You get them checked out. Yeah, you get them checked out, and that really helps for things that I feel absolutely uncomfortable with. And I only started doing that in the past 40 episodes or so once I realized that the podcast was way more popular, and then I was like, I need to take it. Not that I didn't take it seriously beforehand, but I had to I took it was more of a burden. I was like, I make sure that this is the best, most recent information and get it checked over instead of just me updating, just telling a general story.
Yeah. Well, we might have time for an audience question. We're almost out, but either way.
So you've talked about your academic training in terms of having the knowledge for what you're talking about in your podcast, but academic training is also about communicating that knowledge to your students or to your peers. And I'm wondering if that experience, with the communication experience, has helped you frame the structure of your podcasts to tell the stories that you're telling in each episode.
So, you mean in terms of what we know will work as communicating with the public, does it change what we cover or how we do it? I think, yeah.
Well, you get asked to cover things, don't you?
We do, and this is going to sound negative, but you know, people want to hear about wars. I'm not really interested in the nitty-gritty of war, but we have occasionally done that because it would be a yawning gap if we didn't, because, you know, the Roman world was wall-to-wall war. So I guess it does from that point of view. I think we do pull back on some of the detail. I think my editor, Matt, cuts out some of that detail, the way Vanya was talking about it. But I've always been very keen to talk a lot about the sources, because one of the keynotes this morning talking about demystifying, I thought that was really, that really struck a chord with me, that it's really important for me to tell people how we know this stuff.
Well, you do a good job of saying, Suetonius says this, Castillo says this is what we know. Okay, let's move forward.
And telling people where to find it as well, because you're right, JSTOR is hidden from people, but classicists have put an enormous amount of resources up there. They kind of did it in the 90s, so the websites tend to look hokey these days. But a lot of it's out of copyright, so it can just go up there, which is brilliant for us. So we can just refer people to it. So we've gone off course a bit. You guys should answer.
Well, let's hang out in here, but we should officially end the panel now. Sure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.